They say home is where the heart is, but my daughter found room for her new family by sending me to a nursing home, one with peeling wallpaper, roaches in the hallway, and a roommate who screamed in her sleep. When I called, she didn't answer. When I wrote, no reply. They mocked me from my own living room. What they didn't know, I still owned the deed. So I made one quiet call, and days later they were standing on the curb with nowhere to go. You won't believe what happened next. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. Before the nursing home, before the betrayal, before the house I owned for 40 years was stolen from beneath my feet. My name is Grace Pennington, and I once loved my daughter more than anything in this world. For most of my life, I was known around Madison as the library lady with the kind eyes. I spent 42 years behind that circulation desk, helping children find adventure in dusty corners and guiding anxious students through research projects. In the quiet moments between patrons, I'd run my fingers along the spines of books, feeling their texture like old friends. My late husband, Edward, used to tease that I loved those books more than him. Not more, I'd reply, just differently. When Edward died of a heart attack at 53, I was left with our modest craftsman home, a half-empty bed, and our 12-year-old daughter, Melanie. I remember the morning of the funeral, Melanie standing in her black dress, looking so small against the doorframe of her bedroom, asking in a whisper if she could skip the service. I knelt down despite my aching knees and told her, "Sometimes the hardest things we do are the most important." She nodded and took my hand. We faced it together. The next 25 years passed in a blur of packed lunches, parent-teacher conferences, college application essays, and eventually, wedding planning. I spent every spare dollar ensuring Melanie never felt the absence of her father in material ways. I postponed roof repairs so she could attend summer camp. I drove the same car for 18 years so she could have dance lessons and SAT prep courses. Not because I had to, but because I wanted to. Because the light in her eyes was worth every sacrifice. 3 months ago, I fell while watering the hydrangeas Edward and I planted the year we bought our house. Nothing dramatic. My foot caught on the garden hose, and suddenly I was on the ground, my hip throbbing, and my dignity bruised. The neighbor found me and called Melanie, who arrived in her sleek SUV, her face tight with something I initially mistook for concern. "Mom, this is exactly what I've been talking about," she said as she helped me to my feet. "You can't live alone anymore. It's not safe." "It was just a fall, dear," I replied, brushing dirt from my pants. "I'm perfectly capable." "We found a place," she interrupted. "A rehabilitation center where you can recover properly. Just for a few weeks until you're steady again." I should have noted how she avoided my eyes when she said, "a few weeks." I should have questioned why Trent, her husband of 5 years, was measuring my living room with a laser tool while I packed a small suitcase. I should have asked why Melanie insisted I bring my financial documents, just in case. But I didn't, because after all these years I still saw my daughter as that small girl in a black dress, holding my hand at her father's funeral. I still believed we faced things together. I was wrong. Pennington. Grace. The intake nurse butchered my name without looking up from her clipboard. The fluorescent lights above us flickered, casting a sickly glow across the linoleum floor of Lakeside Gardens Care Facility. Room 214. Discharge to be determined. "It's Pennington," I corrected gently. "And my stay is temporary. Just a few weeks of physical therapy." The nurse's eyes flicked briefly to Melanie, who stood behind my wheelchair, an unspoken message passed between them. "Of course," the nurse said, handing me a stack of forms. "Sign these and we'll get you settled." Melanie took the forms before I could reach for them. "I'll handle this, Mom." "You must be tired." I was bone-tired in a way I hadn't experienced since Edward's death. The kind of fatigue that seeps into your marrow and makes every movement feel like swimming through molasses. But even so, I reached for the papers. "I can read them, Melanie." "Mom." Her voice took on the edge I'd been hearing more frequently lately, the tone one might use with a stubborn child. "Trent and I have already reviewed everything. It's standard admission paperwork." As if summoned by his name, Trent appeared from the hallway where he'd been making a phone call. Tall and polished in his tailored suit, he always struck me as a man playing a role rather than living his life. His smile never quite reached his eyes when he looked at me. "All set?" he asked, jangling my car keys, my keys, in his hand. "We should get going if we want to beat traffic." "Don't you want to help me get settled?" I asked, surprised at their haste. Melanie checked her watch, a diamond-crusted thing Trent had given her for their anniversary. "We've got the kids' recital at 4, but we'll be back this weekend to check on you." "Oh." I tried to hide my disappointment. "Of course. The children come first." A flicker of something crossed Melanie's face. Guilt? Impatience? It was gone before I could identify it. She bent down and pressed a perfunctory kiss to my forehead, her expensive perfume momentarily overwhelming the underlying smell of disinfectant that permeated the facility. "We'll come by on weekends," she promised, already backing toward the exit. "The staff has all our numbers. Call if you need anything." I nodded, forcing a smile I didn't feel. "Drive safely. I love you." But they were already halfway to the door, Trent's hand at the small of Melanie's back, guiding her away from me. As they pushed through the automatic doors, I heard Trent laugh and say to my daughter, "We finally got the guest room back." Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. My heart contracted painfully in my chest. The nurse wheeled me toward the elevator, her rubber-soled shoes squeaking against the floor. As we waited, I watched through the smudged glass doors as Trent helped Melanie into the passenger seat of my car. The blue Camry I'd bought when Melanie started high school, now with Melanie's yoga studio bumper sticker covering the one from Edward's favorite fishing spot. "Your daughter said you might be confused sometimes," the nurse commented as we entered the elevator. "Is there someone else we should contact about your care decisions?" "Confused?" I turned to her, startled. "I'm not confused. I had a fall. I'm here for physical therapy, then going home." Another look, this one tinged with pity. "Of course, Mrs. Pennington." "Pennington," I corrected again, more firmly this time. The elevator doors opened onto a floor that immediately tightened my chest with institutional dread. Unlike the relatively bright lobby, this hallway was dimly lit, with wallpaper peeling at the seams and an undercurrent of neglect in every corner. A resident shuffled past in a tattered robe, his feet in worn slippers, his eyes vacant. This wasn't a rehabilitation center. This was a nursing home, and not a good one. "There must be some mistake," I said, as the nurse wheeled me toward room 214. "My daughter said this was a short-term rehabilitation facility. Lakeside Gardens offers various levels of care," she replied vaguely. "Here we are. You'll be sharing with Mrs. Oberman." The room that greeted me was small and sparse, with 2 hospital beds separated by a thin curtain. The window overlooked not a lake, as the facility's name suggested, but the parking lot where I could still see my car, Melanie's car now, apparently, pulling away. An elderly woman lay in the far bed, her white hair wild around a face creased with age. She turned at our entrance and smiled vacantly. "Hello, Margaret," she said. "Did you bring my orange juice?" "This is Grace," the nurse corrected. "Your new roommate." Mrs. Oberman frowned. "No, I don't want a roommate. I told Margaret no roommates." The nurse ignored her, parking my wheelchair beside the empty bed. "Dinner is at 5. Physical therapy will evaluate you tomorrow morning." She handed me a faded hospital gown. "Change into this. Oh, and I'll need to take your shoes." "My shoes?" I clutched the pathetic garment. "Why would you need my shoes?" "Fall precaution. You can have your slippers." She held out her hand expectantly. I looked down at my sensible walking shoes, the ones I'd worn to the library every day for years, the ones that carried me through countless story times and reference desk shifts. Surrendering them felt symbolic in a way I wasn't prepared for. "Could I please speak with the director?" I asked, my librarian's voice returning, polite but firm. "I think there's been a misunderstanding about my situation." The nurse sighed, clearly accustomed to such requests. "I'll let the social worker know you want to talk. She'll be by, eventually. Now, your shoes, please." Feeling strangely powerless, I slipped off my shoes and handed them over. The nurse nodded briskly and left, closing the door behind her with a decisive click. I sat in the wheelchair, still clutching the hospital gown, as Mrs. Oberman began to snore softly across the room. The fading afternoon light cast long shadows across the linoleum floor, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. From somewhere down the hall came the sound of a television, blaring a game show, punctuated by occasional confused shouts from residents. My phone buzzed in my purse, the old flip phone Melanie had tried unsuccessfully to replace with something smarter. I fumbled it open to find a text message with an attached photo. It was from Melanie. Surprise! We're giving the guest room a makeover. Lucas and Eva are so excited to finally have their own spaces. The photo showed Melanie's stepchildren, 13-year-old Lucas and 10-year-old Eva, posing with thumbs up in what was unmistakably my living room. Except, it wasn't my living room anymore. The walls, once the warm sage green Edward and I had chosen together, were now a stark white. My reading chair, the one where I'd nursed Melanie as an infant and read her countless bedtime stories, was gone, replaced by a sleek modern sectional I'd never seen before. They were redecorating my house, not just the guest room, my house. With trembling fingers, I typed, "When will you bring me home?" The reply came quickly. "Let's see how PT goes. Could be a while. Don't worry about the house. We're taking good care of everything." Then, a moment later, "BTW, where's the key to your filing cabinet? Need to check on some paperwork." My blood turned to ice. The filing cabinet contained my deed, Edward's life insurance policy, our wills, all the important documents I'd carefully maintained over decades of home ownership. Before I could reply, a different staff member knocked and entered, younger than the first nurse, with Diane Social Services embroidered on her name tag. She carried a thick folder. "Mrs. Pennington, I'm here to review your care plan." "There's been a mistake," I said immediately. "I'm supposed to be in rehabilitation, not whatever this place is. I need to go home once I've recovered from my fall." Diane consulted her folder, her expression carefully neutral. "According to your intake forms, you've been admitted for long-term care. Your daughter filled out a permanent placement directive." The words hit me like physical blows. Long-term, permanent placement. "That can't be right," I whispered. "Show me the forms." She hesitated, then turned the folder so I could see. There was my name, spelled correctly this time, and beside it, the admission type, permanent residential care. Below that, Melanie's signature on the line marked, responsible party. "But I didn't agree to this," I protested, "and Melanie doesn't have authority to make these decisions for me. I'm completely competent." Diane shifted uncomfortably. "Your daughter indicated you've been experiencing memory issues and declining physical health. She provided medical documentation from Dr. Reynolds." Dr. Reynolds? Trent's golf buddy who had examined me exactly once, for less than 15 minutes after my fall. "I want to see everything my daughter signed," I said, my voice steady despite the earthquake happening inside me. Diane flipped through the documents, showing me form after form bearing Melanie's signature. Near the back was a page that made my stomach drop, a discharge waiver, indicating that I would not be returning to independent living and authorizing the facility to dispose of personal effects not claimed within 30 days. Dispose of personal effects, as if I were already dead. "I didn't authorize any of this," I said, folding my hands in my lap to hide their trembling. "I want to speak with my daughter immediately." "Of course, you can use the resident phone in the common area." Diane's tone was sympathetic but distanced, the way one might speak to a child having a tantrum. "But first, we need to complete your intake assessment." For the next hour, I answered questions about my medical history, my daily routine, my bathroom habits, all while fighting the rising tide of panic in my chest. By the time Diane left, promising to schedule a follow-up meeting once I'd settled in, the reality of my situation had begun to crystallize with terrible clarity. This wasn't a temporary stay for rehabilitation. This was abandonment. Melanie and Trent had orchestrated this, the fall providing the perfect opportunity to implement a plan they must have been considering for some time. My house, my belongings, my life. They were taking all of it, while warehousing me in this dismal facility at the edge of town. I changed into the hospital gown, its thin fabric a poor substitute for the clothes I'd packed, which now sat untouched in my suitcase. Mrs. Oberman continued to sleep across the room, occasionally muttering names I didn't recognize. That night, after a dinner of overcooked chicken and mushy vegetables served on institutional plastic trays, I tried calling Melanie. The call went straight to voicemail. I tried Trent's number with the same result. I left messages for both, keeping my voice calm, asking them to call me back to clear up some confusion. No one called. I lay in the unfamiliar bed, listening to Mrs. Oberman's labored breathing and the occasional squeak of nurses' shoes in the hallway. The mattress crackled beneath me, covered in plastic, like a child's bed. The blanket was thin, the pillow flat. Everything smelled faintly of industrial cleaner and something else. Hopelessness, perhaps. My mind raced through my options, but each path seemed to end at the same dead end. I had no car. My phone would eventually run out of minutes. My wallet contained only $43 in cash. And according to the papers Diane had shown me, Melanie had told them I suffered from confusion and memory problems, which meant any protests I made would likely be attributed to my supposed condition. It was the perfect trap, one constructed by the person I had sacrificed everything for. The person I had raised alone after Edward died. The person who now saw me as nothing more than an inconvenience to be stored away while she claimed my home as her own. As I stared at the water stain on the ceiling, a memory surfaced from years ago. Melanie at 16, asking why we couldn't move to a better neighborhood, like her friend Jessica's family. I had gently explained that our modest home was what we could afford on my librarian's salary, and that there was value in living within our means. "When you grow up," I had told her, "you can live wherever you want. But remember that a home isn't about how it looks to others. It's about the love inside it." She had rolled her eyes then, a teenager embarrassed by her mother's sentimentality. But I never imagined that 25 years later, she would decide that my home, the one I had maintained through decades of single motherhood, was something she could simply take. A tear slipped down my cheek, followed by another, until I was silently weeping in the darkness of room 214. Not just for the betrayal, but for the revelation of who my daughter had become when I wasn't looking. In the morning, I would begin to gather information. I would find out exactly what Melanie had done and what my legal options were. I would not simply accept this new reality she had crafted for me, because while she might have inherited Edward's determined chin and my love of mystery novels, she had clearly forgotten the most important lesson I ever taught her: that quiet people, librarians, widows, mothers, often possess the deepest reservoirs of strength, and she had just given me every reason to draw from mine. I lay awake most of that first night, listening to Mrs. Obermann's labored breathing, punctuated by occasional murmurings about someone named Harold. The plastic mattress cover crinkled with every slight movement, and the institutional blanket, thin as hope, did little to ward off the aggressive air conditioning. But it wasn't physical discomfort keeping me awake. It was the calculations. Over 40 years as a librarian had taught me to approach problems methodically. Research, cross-reference, verify sources, find the thread that unravels the knot. So as moonlight filtered through the cheap blinds, casting prison bar shadows across my new quarters, I began to catalog what I knew for certain. 1. Melanie did not have power of attorney. Edward and I had created our wills through our friend Mark Fletcher when Melanie was still in middle school. I'd updated mine after Edward's death, but never assigned anyone legal authority to make decisions for me. An oversight, perhaps, but now a potentially crucial one. 2. The house was still in my name. I had paid off the mortgage 7 years ago, celebrating with a small glass of sherry on the front porch, where Edward and I once watched sunsets. The deed was in my filing cabinet, the same cabinet Melanie had just texted me about. 3. I had approximately 3 weeks before my next doctor's appointment, which would have been my opportunity to tell someone outside this facility that something was wrong. By morning, I had my plan. Mrs. Obermann was still asleep when the breakfast cart clattered down the hallway at 6:30 a.m., pushed by a tired-looking aide who barely glanced at me as she dropped off a tray of rubbery scrambled eggs and toast that could have doubled as roofing material. "Excuse me," I said, using the same tone that had quieted rowdy teenagers in the library's study section for decades. "I'd like to speak with the head nurse, please." The aide, her name tag read Brenda, looked mildly surprised that I'd addressed her directly. Shift change happening now, maybe in an hour. "It's important," I persisted. "It's regarding my medication." Medication, the magic word in places like this. Brenda nodded curtly. "I'll let her know." An hour later, a harried woman with tightly pulled back hair and a clipboard appeared in my doorway. "Mrs. Pennington, I'm Nurse Helen. You had a medication concern?" "Yes," I said, lowering my voice conspiratorially. "Could we speak privately?" She glanced at Mrs. Obermann, who was now awake and staring vacantly at a muted television mounted in the corner. "She doesn't understand much. You can speak freely." I'd really prefer to step into the hallway, I insisted. With poorly disguised impatience, Nurse Helen helped me from the bed and into the wheelchair parked nearby. My hip protested, a dull ache that reminded me why this charade had been possible in the first place. In the hallway, away from Mrs. Obermann's unseeing gaze, I switched tactics. Actually, I don't have a medication issue. I need to make an important phone call, and I was told I could use the resident phone. Nurse Helen's expression hardened. That's what this is about? The phone is in the common area. You can use it during free hours, 10 to 4. I need to make a private call to my attorney. Her eyebrow arched slightly. Your daughter handles your legal affairs now. That's in your file. My daughter has no legal authority over me, I said, meeting her gaze steadily. And I'd like to confirm that with my attorney. Mrs. Pennington, many residents go through an adjustment period. It's perfectly normal to feel some confusion or resistance about your new living situation. Her tone was practiced, patronizing. Your daughter has your best interests at heart. My daughter has my house in her sights, I replied, my voice quiet but firm. And I'd like to speak with my attorney before she succeeds in taking it. Something in my clarity must have given her pause. She studied me for a long moment, then sighed. I'll see what I can do, but I can't promise anything until after the care planning meeting this afternoon. The meeting was as demoralizing as I'd expected. A room full of staff discussing me as if I were a collection of symptoms rather than a person. They referenced Melanie's statements about my increasing confusion and paranoia as if they were established facts. When I attempted to correct them, the social worker, Diane from yesterday, patted my hand and made a note that likely reinforced their perception of my mental state. By the time I was wheeled back to my room, defeat sat heavy on my shoulders. Nurse Helen had not returned with any news about my phone call request. That afternoon, during the mandated recreation hour in the common area, a depressing affair involving a half-hearted game of bingo, led by a volunteer who couldn't pronounce the residents' names, I spotted a younger nurse I hadn't seen before. She moved differently than the others, with a gentle efficiency that suggested she actually saw the humans in her care. Her nameplate read, Lydia Romero. I waited until she came near, then quietly asked for a cup of water. When she brought it, I thanked her by name. You're welcome, Mrs. Pennington, she replied, and the fact that she'd bothered to learn my correctly pronounced name nearly brought me to tears. Lydia, I said softly, I need help making a private call. It's important. She glanced around, then knelt beside my wheelchair, ostensibly adjusting my blanket. The phones are monitored during the day. Notes are made about who residents call. Her dark eyes met mine with unexpected sympathy. If it's really important, I'm on the night shift, after 11 o'clock, when things quiet down. A small flame of hope kindled in my chest. Thank you. That night, I pretended to sleep as the evening staff made their rounds. Mrs. Obermann was given something that made her snores deeper, more regular. The hallway lights dimmed at 10 o'clock, and the building settled into the eerie half-silence of institutional nights. Distant beeping, occasional coughs, the squeak of rubber soles on linoleum during hourly checks. At 11:23, Lydia appeared in my doorway like a guardian angel in purple scrubs. Come on, she whispered. Most of the night staff are in the break room. She helped me into the wheelchair and navigated the darkened hallways with practiced ease, bringing me to a small office near the nurses' station. Inside was a desk phone that looked recently installed, unlike the ancient resident phone in the common area. "You have about 10 minutes," she said, closing the door softly behind her. With trembling fingers, I dialed a number I knew by heart. One I'd called countless times when Edward and I were setting up our modest estate. 1 ring, 2, 3. I glanced anxiously at the door. "Hello?" A groggy voice answered. "Mark?" "It's Grace Pennington." "Grace!" There was rustling on the other end, the sound of someone sitting up in bed. "It's nearly midnight. Is everything all right?" "No," I said simply. "Everything is not all right, and I need your help." "No," I said simply. "Everything is not all right, and I need your help." Mark was immediately alert, the grogginess vanishing from his voice. "What's happened? Where are you?" "I'm at Lakeside Gardens. It's a nursing home on the east side of town." I kept my voice low, eyes fixed on the door. "Melanie had me admitted here after I fell in the garden. She told me it was temporary, for rehabilitation. It's not..." "Slow down, Grace. Are you saying Melanie put you in a nursing home against your will?" "Yes." The single word carried the weight of my betrayal. "She's moved into my house with Trent and the children. They're redecorating. And according to the staff here, she's signed papers for my permanent placement." A long pause. "Does she have power of attorney? Healthcare proxy? Number?" "We never completed those documents. After Edward died, I updated my will making her my beneficiary. But I never signed over any decision-making authority." "You're certain?" "Absolutely certain." If there was one thing a career in library science had given me, it was a meticulous memory for documents. "You prepared the will yourself, Mark. 15 years ago in your downtown office, I was wearing my blue cardigan, and you had just put up new photographs of your grandchildren." A soft chuckle came through the line. "Still sharp as ever, Grace. All right, here's what I need to know. Are you being mistreated, physically restrained, denied medication?" "Number nothing that dramatic, just warehoused, placed on the forgotten shelf." I glanced at the clock on the wall. "Mark, what I need to know is, can Melanie legally take my house? She's asking for keys to my filing cabinet, which is where I keep the deed." "Without power of attorney or a conservatorship, she has no legal right to your property." His tone was firm, reassuring. "The house is still yours, Grace. You can sell it tomorrow if you want to." A wave of relief washed over me. "Then that's exactly what I intend to do." "Sell your house?" Mark sounded surprised. "Where would you go?" I hadn't thought that far ahead, but an idea was forming, born of both practicality and a quieter, deeper emotion I wasn't quite ready to name. "Do you remember the Madison Community Housing Trust? Edward and I used to volunteer with them before he died." "Of course. They buy properties to maintain affordable housing stock. Edward was on their board for a while, wasn't he?" "Yes. They helped that young single mother, Jennifer, find a home after her husband left." The memory was clear. Edward and I delivering a housewarming basket to a tearful young woman and her toddler as they moved into their first stable home after months in a shelter. "I'd like to contact them, see if they're interested in my house." Silence stretched across the line. When Mark spoke again, his voice had softened. "Grace, are you sure? This is a significant decision, one you might not be able to undo." "I'm quite sure," I replied, surprising myself with my certainty. Melanie made her choice when she lied to me and tried to take what wasn't hers to take. Now I'm making mine. Lydia appeared in the doorway, tapping her watch. Our time was running short. "Mark, I need to go, but can you start the process? Find out if the trust is interested." I'll call them first thing tomorrow. But Grace, I need a way to reach you. Do you have a mobile phone? Yes, but limited minutes. And I'm not sure how private it is here. I glanced at Lydia, who was keeping watch in the hallway. What if we set a time for me to call you? Tomorrow night, same time. That works. And Grace, hang in there. We'll figure this out. As I hung up, a curious lightness filled my chest, the first moment of hope since arriving at Lakeside Gardens. Lydia helped me back to my room, her steps quick but careful. Did you reach who you needed? She whispered as we neared my door. Yes. Thank you, Lydia. You have no idea what that meant to me. She smiled, a brief flash of warmth in the institutional dimness. I think I do. My grandmother was placed in a facility not much better than this one. No one listened to her either. The simple acknowledgement that I was being heard, that my situation was real and not a product of confusion, nearly brought me to tears. Will you be working tomorrow night? I asked as she helped me back into bed. Every night this week. Night shift pays better and I've got a kid in college. She straightened my blanket with gentle efficiency. Need the phone again tomorrow? If possible, same time. I'll try. She hesitated at the door. Mrs. Pennington, whatever you're planning, be careful. These places have ways of making trouble for residents who don't fall in line. I nodded, understanding the warning. 42 years as a librarian taught me something about flying under the radar, Lydia. I can be very quiet when I need to be. She smiled again. I bet you can. The next 3 days passed in a blur of institutional routines, tasteless meals, perfunctory physical therapy sessions, recreation hours that felt more like detention than enrichment. I participated in everything with placid compliance, drawing no attention to myself. When the social worker stopped by to check on my adjustment, I spoke of accepting my new circumstances. When a nurse asked about my mood, I smiled and said I was doing fine, just fine. All the while, Lydia helped me make my nightly calls to Mark, each one bringing me closer to freedom. On the first night, Mark confirmed the Housing Trust's interest. The executive director nearly fell off her chair when I mentioned your address, he reported. Apparently, your neighborhood has become quite desirable. Developers have been buying up the older homes, tearing them down, and building luxury duplexes. Like what Trent would want to do, I murmured, remembering his constant comments about my home's untapped potential. Exactly. The trust is excited about the possibility of preserving your craftsmen as affordable housing. They've offered a fair market price, not what a developer would pay, but reasonable. I don't need top dollar, I assured him. I just need enough to secure my independence. On the second night, Mark walked me through the paperwork he'd prepared. I've drafted a deed transfer that includes a special provision, he explained. The current occupants, meaning Melanie and Trent, will be required to vacate within 14 days of the sale. The thought of Melanie being evicted from my home gave me pause, a mother's instinct to protect even now. Is that legal? They'll have nowhere to go. They have their own home, Grace, Mark reminded me gently. The condo Trent bought in Middleton. They chose to move into your house without permission. They'll simply have to move back to their own property. He was right, of course. Melanie and Trent weren't destitute. They were opportunistic. Still, I couldn't help but wonder how we'd arrived at this point. My only child and I locked in a silent property dispute. On the third night, everything was ready. Mark had secured a notary who would visit me the following day, posing as a volunteer bringing library books to residents. The trust had approved the sale price and expedited their review process out of respect for Edward's past service on their board. "Once you sign tomorrow, the trust will file the paperwork immediately," Mark explained. "Melanie and Trent should receive the formal notice to vacate within 48 hours. "And they can't contest it?" A flutter of anxiety stirred in my chest. "They have no legal grounds, Grace. The house is yours to sell. All the documentation is in order." After we hung up, I sat in the wheelchair as Lydia prepared to take me back to my room, suddenly overwhelmed by the finality of what I was about to do. "Having second thoughts?" Lydia asked softly, noting my expression. "Not about selling," I clarified. "About what comes after. This will sever whatever relationship Melanie and I have left. She'll never forgive me." Lydia knelt before me, her eyes level with mine. "Mrs. Pennington, forgive me for speaking plainly, but your daughter dumped you in this place and took your house. What kind of relationship is that worth preserving?" Her words struck with the force of simple truth. What indeed was I trying to save? The daughter who had loved me, who had held my hand at her father's funeral. That person seemed to have vanished long ago, replaced by a woman who saw me as an inconvenience to be stored away while she claimed what was mine. "You're right," I said finally. "Some bridges, once burned, can't be rebuilt. They can only be acknowledged as ash." The next morning, the volunteer arrived with a cart of books and a notary stamp hidden in her bag. In the privacy of the facility's small chapel, I signed the deed transfer with a steady hand. By noon, my house legally belonged to the Madison Community Housing Trust, and the 14-day eviction notice was being processed. By dinner time, I felt a strange sense of peace, like the calm that comes after closing a book, whose ending, while not happy, feels right and true. I had no idea that across town, Trent was just opening his mail. Sleep came easily that night, the first truly restful slumber I'd had since arriving at Lakeside Gardens. No anxious calculations kept me awake, no burning sense of injustice. Just the quiet certainty that I had taken back control in the only way available to me. Morning arrived with watery sunlight filtering through the blinds and the usual clattering of breakfast carts in the hallway. Mrs. Oberman was having one of her more lucid days and asked if I'd seen her cat, a question I had learned to answer with gentle redirection rather than truth. I was halfway through my rubbery scrambled eggs when Lydia appeared in the doorway, still in her night shift scrubs, her expression tense. "Mrs. Pennington," she said, her voice carefully neutral, though her eyes conveyed urgency. "You have a visitor in the front lobby." Visitors weren't allowed before 10 a.m. according to the facility's strict rules. Only one person would have the entitlement to ignore such policies. "My daughter?" I confirmed, setting down my fork. Lydia nodded, stepping closer to murmur, "She seems upset. Nurse Helen wanted to bring her straight back, but I suggested they call you first. Thought you might want a minute to prepare." The thoughtfulness of this small intervention touched me deeply. "Thank you, Lydia. Want me to tell them you're not feeling well today?" The offer was tempting, a reprieve from the confrontation I knew was coming, but delaying would only prolong the inevitable. "No," I said, straightening my shoulders. "I'll see her. But I'd like to meet in the chapel, not my room. It's more private." Lydia helped me into the wheelchair, her movements efficiently gentle. "I'm off shift in 20 minutes, but I'll make sure they know where to bring her." As we moved down the hallway toward the small non-denominational chapel at the end of the east wing, Lydia leaned down as if adjusting my blanket. "Whatever happens," she whispered, "remember you did nothing wrong. This was your house, Your choice. The simple validation fortified me as she left me in the chapel, a modest room with 4 short pews, a wooden lectern, and stained glass windows that had probably been salvaged from a renovated church. The room smelled faintly of furniture polish and the artificial flowers arranged on a small table near the wall. I didn't have to wait long. The door swung open with more force than necessary, and Melanie strode in, her face flushed with anger beneath a perfect blowout, and designer sunglasses pushed back on her head. She wore the cashmere sweater I'd given her last Christmas, an extravagance I'd saved 3 months to afford, paired with slim-fitting jeans and boots that probably cost more than my monthly pension. "What have you done?" she demanded without preamble, her voice tight with barely controlled fury. I met her gaze steadily. "I've sold my house." "Your house? Your—" She stopped, huffing out an incredulous breath. "Mom, you can't live alone anymore. We discussed this. That's why you're here." "We never discussed anything, Melanie. You lied to me about this facility, about how long I'd be staying. You moved into my home without permission and began redecorating before I'd been gone 24 hours. She flinched slightly at the accuracy of my assessment, but rallied quickly. "We were going to talk about making it official once you'd settled in here. The transition is always difficult. That's what the doctors said. We were trying to make it easier for you. By telling the staff I'm confused, by claiming I can't make my own decisions." My voice remained calm, though I could feel heat rising in my cheeks. "That wasn't kindness, Melanie. That was convenience." She paced the small space, her boots clicking against the linoleum. "You don't understand. We're trying to provide stability for the kids. Lucas and Eva need their own rooms, not that tiny condo. And the schools in your neighborhood are so much better." "Then you should have asked." The simplicity of this truth hung between us. You should have asked, not taken. Asked what? If we could move in while you lived here, if we could buy your house eventually. You would have said no. "You don't know that," I said quietly, "because you never gave me the chance." She stopped pacing and turned to face me directly, switching tactics. "Mom, listen. Trent got this notice in the mail yesterday. Some housing organization claims they own the house now. It has to be a scam. We need to call the police." "It's not a scam, Melanie. I sold the house to the Madison Community Housing Trust." Her face went pale, then flushed again. "You... what? How? You've been here. You can't just..." "I made a phone call. Several, actually. The trust made a fair offer, and I accepted." "Without telling us? Without even considering what this does to our family?" Her voice rose, trembling with indignation. "You didn't consider what it would do to me when you abandoned me here," I replied evenly. "When you lied about how long I'd be staying, when you began dismantling my life within hours of dropping me off." "That's not fair. We're taking care of you. Do you have any idea how much this place costs?" "About half what you'd pay for a decent facility, I'd imagine. And yes, I know exactly how much it costs. I reviewed the billing statement yesterday. Medicare covers most of it, and my pension handles the rest. You haven't paid a dime, Melanie." She stared at me, momentarily speechless. Then, in a voice suddenly small and hurt, "How could you do this? Where are we supposed to go?" "Back to your condo, I presume. The one you and Trent purchased 2 years ago." "But the kids will adjust," I finished for her. "Children are resilient that way." She sank onto the pew across from me, her anger deflating into something more calculated. "Mom, please, let's fix this. We can work something out. Maybe a A formal arrangement. Trent could draw up a proper agreement. We could pay you rent. The suggestion might have tempted me 2 weeks ago, but something had shifted inside me. A quiet clarity about boundaries and consequences that comes perhaps from having decades of perspective. No, Melanie. The decision is made. The trust will maintain the house as affordable housing for a family who needs it, not wants it. The papers are signed. So you'd rather give your home to strangers than to your own daughter? Your only child? Her voice broke on the last words, a performance of hurt I might once have responded to, with immediate guilt and capitulation. I didn't give it to strangers. I sold it at fair market value. And yes, I'd rather see it go to a family who will respect what it represents than watch you and Trent erase every trace of the life your father and I built there. She stood abruptly, tears glistening but not falling. Melanie had always been careful about her mascara. This isn't over. Trent's already talking to lawyers. We can contest this. Prove you weren't in your right mind. You're welcome to try, I said calmly. But it won't work. I've been examined by the facility doctor, who found me perfectly competent. The trust had their attorney review everything carefully. Your father's friend Mark handled all the paperwork. Mark Fletcher? Dad's old golf buddy? Her eyes widened with betrayal, as if I'd corrupted a family ally. How did you even contact him? I made a phone call, Melanie. I'm old, not incapacitated. We stared at each other across the small chapel, the distance between us no longer measurable in feet, but in the vast gulf of understanding neither of us seemed able to bridge. You chose them over me, she finally said, her voice low and accusing. Trent, the kids, all of us. You threw us out on the street. The unfairness of this characterization might have once compelled me to defend myself, to soothe her wounded pride. Instead, I simply stated the truth. You chose them over me. And now, I'm choosing me. Her face hardened at my words, the last pretense of filial concern dropping away. Fine, have it your way. Enjoy this place. It's all you've got left now. She turned on her heel and stalked toward the door, her parting shot hanging in the air. Don't expect us to visit. Bersa. The door closed behind her with a decisive click that echoed in the small space. I sat alone in my wheelchair, hands folded in my lap, feeling neither triumph nor regret, only the strange, weightless sensation of having finally cut an anchor that had been dragging me down. After a few minutes, I grasped the wheels of my chair and slowly propelled myself from the chapel, back toward the reality of my current circumstances. But with each turn of the wheels, I felt something new building within me. Not the hollow victory of revenge, but the quiet strength of having chosen dignity over blind devotion. Melanie was right about one thing. This place was what I had now. But it wouldn't be all I had forever. Not anymore. Melanie was right about one thing. This place was what I had now. But it wouldn't be all I had forever. Not anymore. I wheeled myself back toward my room, the corridor eerily quiet in the mid-morning lull between breakfast and the mandated activities. At the nurse's station, I caught a glimpse of Nurse Helen speaking in hushed tones with another staff member, their eyes following me with newfound wariness. News of Melanie's visit, and likely its contentious nature, had already spread through the facility's efficient grapevine. I had just reached my door when Diane from Social Services appeared, her clipboard clutched to her chest like a shield. Mrs. Pennington, she said with forced brightness, I heard your daughter stop by. I was hoping we could talk about your care plan moving forward. Of course, I replied, keeping my voice pleasantly neutral. though I'm not sure what there is to discuss." She glanced around before lowering her voice. "There might be some changes regarding your financial arrangements." So that was it. Melanie had threatened to withdraw financial support. Support that, as I'd pointed out during our confrontation, she wasn't actually providing. "I'm quite capable of managing my own finances," I assured her. "My Medicare and supplemental insurance cover most of my stay here, and my pension handles the remainder. I've reviewed the billing statements." Diane looked momentarily thrown. "Yes, well, there's also the matter of your living situation. When resident circumstances change, we like to reassess." "My circumstances haven't changed," I interrupted gently. "I'm still the same person who was admitted 2 weeks ago. The only difference is that I've sold a house I wasn't living in anyway." She shifted uncomfortably. "Your daughter seemed quite upset." "Yes," I acknowledged. "She was." After an awkward pause, during which I offered nothing more, Diane retreated with a promise to follow up later. I entered my room to find Mrs. Oberman dozing and a lunch tray already waiting, earlier than usual with a small cup of chocolate pudding added. Perhaps a peace offering from the kitchen staff who'd overheard Melanie's dramatic exit. The next few days passed in a blur of small kindnesses and subtle changes. Lydia brought me library books without my having to ask. Mysteries by Louise Penny that reminded me of my cataloging days. The physical therapist spent an extra 15 minutes helping me with exercises to strengthen my hip. Even Mrs. Oberman, in one of her lucid moments, patted my hand and told me, "You stand your ground, dear." My Harold always said a woman needs her own money and her own mind. Mark called with updates that Lydia relayed during her shifts. Trent had indeed contacted attorneys, but had been firmly rebuffed. The trust had accelerated the eviction timeline, giving them 10 days instead of 14 to vacate, citing concerns about potential property damage from disgruntled occupants. "They're packing up," Mark reported. "My contact at the trust drove by yesterday, moving boxes in the driveway, furniture being loaded into a truck." I absorbed this news with complicated emotions. The house on Maple Street had been my home for 43 years. I'd brought Melanie home from the hospital to that house. Edward and I had celebrated anniversaries, birthdays, graduations within those walls. Now strangers would live there, cook in my kitchen, plant different flowers in my garden. Yet somehow, the thought brought more peace than pain. "The trust director wanted me to tell you something," Mark continued. "They're not changing much about the house. They believe in preserving the character of these older homes, just making them accessible to families who couldn't otherwise afford the neighborhood." This small assurance meant more than Mark could know. Not everything I had built would be erased. By the end of the week, I received unexpected news from an unlikely source. Diane appeared at my door, her usual clipboard replaced by a thick folder. "Mrs. Pennington, we need to discuss your discharge planning," she announced. "Discharge?" I echoed, genuinely surprised. I was under the impression this was meant to be a permanent placement. Her smile was tight. "Circumstances change. Your daughter has withdrawn her support for your continued stay here, and our reassessment indicates you don't actually meet the criteria for long-term care. Your mobility has improved significantly with physical therapy." I hid a smile at the transparent attempt to frame my ejection as a medical decision rather than financial retaliation. "I see. And where am I meant to go, given that I no longer own my house?" Diane looked uncomfortable. "Well, that's what we need to discuss. Normally, residents return to family. But in your case, in my case, that's not an option," I finished for her. Perhaps you could give me a few days to make arrangements." She seemed relieved at my calm acceptance. "Of course, we can provide resources for senior apartments, though there are usually waiting lists." "That won't be necessary," I said. "I've already been in contact with some resources of my own." The truth was, I had been quietly making plans since the day I sold the house. Mark had helped me connect with Jessica Orozco, the executive director of the housing trust, who had immediately offered me one of their transitional apartments, a small one-bedroom unit in a converted Victorian near downtown, specifically designed for seniors on fixed incomes. "It seems only fair," Jessica had said when we spoke on the phone Lydia smuggled to me. "Your house will eventually help 3 families find stable housing once we convert it. The least we can do is ensure you have the same." When I told Lydia about the discharge plans that night, her response surprised me. "I'm giving notice tomorrow," she announced, restocking my bedside water pitcher. "This place has always been bad, but the way they've treated you, dumping you as soon as the money dried up." She shook her head in disgust. "There's a clinic downtown that's hiring. Better hours, better ethics." "I'm sorry to have cost you a job," I said, genuinely concerned. She laughed softly. "Mrs. Pennington, you didn't cost me anything. You showed me something about standing up for yourself, no matter your age." She paused, then added more quietly, "My grandmother never got that chance." 2 days later, as I packed my meager belongings into the same small suitcase I'd arrived with, I found myself oddly grateful for the brief, terrible chapter at Lakeside Gardens. Without it, I might never have discovered the steel in my spine. I might have continued sacrificing my own dignity at the altar of maternal obligation, watching silently as Melanie and Trent stripped away the life I'd built layer by layer. Mrs. Oberman was napping when I finished packing. I left her a note and one of the Louise Penny novels, though I wasn't sure she'd remember me tomorrow. Diane appeared with discharge papers, which I signed with the same steady hand that had signed the deed transfer a week earlier. "Your transportation is here," she announced, a perfunctory smile plastered on her face. I had expected a taxi, or perhaps one of the Trust's volunteers. Instead, when I was wheeled to the front entrance, walking felt too symbolically important for this moment. I found Lydia waiting beside her modest sedan, out of uniform in jeans and a bright blue sweater. "My shift ended an hour ago," she explained with a grin. "Thought you might like a friendlier send-off." Behind her stood a slender man in his 60s wearing wire-rimmed glasses and a cardigan that reminded me powerfully of Edward. "Mark Fletcher." He introduced himself with a warm handshake. "Thought it was time we spoke in person rather than through midnight phone calls." As they helped me into Lydia's car, several residents watched from the windows. One elderly man in a wheelchair raised his hand in a small salute. A woman I recognized from physical therapy classes nodded approvingly. Small acknowledgments from those who understood exactly what this moment represented. We drove away from Lakeside Gardens under a bright autumn sky, the leaves beginning to turn the same russet red that Edward had loved. I didn't look back at the facility that had briefly caged me. Instead, I looked ahead to the streets of Madison, familiar yet somehow new, as if I were seeing them through transformed eyes. "We'll get you settled in the apartment," Mark said from the front passenger seat. "Jessica from the Trust will meet us there with the keys. It's nothing fancy, but it's clean and safe. And temporary," I added, a new idea taking shape as we drove. "Just until I figure out what comes next. Because for the first time in decades, what comes next felt like a horizon of possibilities rather than a narrowing tunnel of loss and reduction." I hadn't merely survived Melanie's betrayal. I had emerged from it with a clearer sense of who I was and what I deserved. As we turned onto Marshall Street, heading toward downtown and my new temporary home, Lydia glanced at me in the rearview mirror. "You okay back there, Mrs. Pennington?" she asked. I smiled, feeling the warm autumn sunlight on my face through the car window. "Better than okay," I replied. "I'm just getting started." The Trust's transitional apartment exceeded my modest expectations. Located on the second floor of a converted Victorian on Langdon Street, it offered high ceilings, original hardwood floors, and windows that flooded the small space with natural light. The furniture was simple but thoughtfully arranged. A comfortable reading chair positioned to catch the morning sun, a small dining table just right for two, a wooden bed frame reminiscent of one Edward and I had when we were first married. Jessica Orozco, the Trust's executive director, met us with keys and a welcome basket filled with practical items: tea, honey, soap, and a handmade quilt from the local senior center. "It's our standard welcome package," she explained, a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and practical energy. "But I added a few library books. Mark mentioned you were a librarian." The thoughtfulness of this gesture, acknowledging not just what I needed but who I was, brought unexpected tears to my eyes. "Thank you," I said simply. Jessica smiled. "Edward would have been proud of what you've done, Mrs. Pennington. He always believed housing shouldn't be about profit, but about providing homes." The mention of Edward sent a pang through my chest, not the sharp grief of early widowhood, but the softer ache of remembering someone deeply understood. "He would have approved of the Trust getting our house," I agreed. "We're going to honor that gift," Jessica assured me. "Starting next month, a single mother with 2 children will move in. She's a nurse working at the university hospital." The symmetry felt right somehow. A healer would live in the home where I had tried, in my own way, to provide care and comfort. After Jessica left, Mark and Lydia helped me unpack my few belongings. The process took hardly any time at all, a stark reminder of how little I had brought from my previous life. One suitcase of clothes, a few personal items, the photographs I'd managed to tuck into my bag before Melanie whisked me away. "I should get some groceries for you," Lydia said, glancing at the small kitchenette. "Actually," Mark interjected, checking his watch, "I've arranged for dinner to be delivered, and tomorrow, I thought we might visit my office to discuss your new financial situation." I raised an eyebrow. "My financial situation?" "The proceeds from the house sale," he explained. "After closing costs and fees, it's a substantial sum. We need to discuss how you want it managed." The reality of my new circumstances began to sink in. I had sold my home, my largest asset, and now possessed liquid capital for perhaps the first time in my adult life. Not a fortune by modern standards, but enough to secure my independence in ways I hadn't anticipated when I made that first desperate phone call from Lakeside Gardens. "I'd like to make a donation to the Trust," I said immediately. "They've done so much." Mark smiled. "Already anticipated that. We can discuss the details tomorrow. For now, just settle in." After a delivered dinner of soup and sandwiches from a nearby deli, Mark left with promises to return in the morning. Lydia lingered, helping me organize the small bathroom and making notes of items I might need. "I should get going," she finally said, though she seemed reluctant to leave. "My son's coming home from college this weekend. Need to clean up a bit." "Thank you, Lydia," I said, taking her hands in mine. "For everything. I wouldn't be here without you." She squeezed my hands. "You would have found a way. You're stronger than you know, Mrs. Pennington. Grace, I corrected gently. After everything, I think you should call me Grace. After she left, I stood alone in the center of my new temporary home, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of downtown Madison. Distant traffic, voices of students from the nearby university, the occasional bell from the Capitol building. So different from the sterile quiet of lakeside gardens or the suburban stillness of my old neighborhood. I moved to the window and looked out at the twilight settling over the city, feeling a curious weightlessness. For most of my adult life, I had been defined by my responsibilities. Edward's wife, Melanie's mother, the reliable neighborhood librarian. Now, for the first time in decades, I was simply Grace. That night, I slept deeply in the unfamiliar bed, waking only when sunlight filtered through the simple white curtains. No crinkling plastic mattress, no roommates' confused muttering, no squeak of nurses' shoes in the hallway. Just the gentle sounds of a city coming awake and the distant chime of the university bell tower, marking the hour. I made tea in the small kitchenette, cradling the mug as I sat by the window watching students hurry to morning classes. Their youth and purpose reminded me of my early days at the library, the satisfaction of connecting people with exactly the book they didn't know they needed. Mark arrived promptly at 10, bearing pastries from a nearby bakery and a leather portfolio tucked under his arm. Over flaky croissants, he outlined my new financial reality, the proceeds from the house sale, my modest pension, and Social Security benefits. Combined, it's enough for you to live comfortably, he concluded. Not lavishly, but securely. The trust apartment is yours for 6 months, rent-free, after which you can choose to stay at a reduced rate or look for something else. Options, I murmured, the word tasting sweet on my tongue. I haven't had those in quite some time. There's something else, Mark said, his expression turning serious. I think we should update your will and advance directives. After what happened. He didn't need to finish the thought. Yes, I agreed immediately. No ambiguity this time. We spent the next hour revising my will. The most significant change came when Mark asked, "And for your primary beneficiary?" The question hung in the air between us. For most of my adult life, the answer had been automatic. Melanie, my only child, the continuation of myself and Edward in the world. But something had shifted fundamentally in those moments at Lakeside Gardens when I realized the depth of her betrayal. Not just an impulsive mistake, but a calculated decision to warehouse me and claim what was mine. The Madison Community Housing Trust, I said finally, for most of it, with specific provisions. Mark's expression remained neutral, but his pen hesitated briefly over the legal pad. Are you certain? Disinheriting a child is a significant step. I'm not doing this out of vengeance, I clarified, surprised at how certain I felt. What happened with Melanie revealed something important, that she sees my assets as her entitlement, rather than my security. If I die with her as my beneficiary, she'll simply receive what she tried to take prematurely. Mark nodded slowly. And the specific provisions? A college fund for Eva, I said, thinking of Melanie's quieter stepdaughter, who had once shown me her school art project with shy pride. In trust until she's 18. She shouldn't be punished for her parents' actions. Nothing for Lucas? Mark asked. I considered this. Number. He's too much like Trent already, taking photos of my living room for social media before I'd even left the driveway. The memory still stung, the casual erasure of my existence, the gleeful claiming of my space. With the paperwork complete, Mark asked gently, "Have you heard from Melanie since?" "No," I replied simply. I don't expect to. 3 weeks later, settled into a rhythm in my new apartment, I found myself at the downtown branch of the Madison Public Library. The familiar smell of books and the hushed atmosphere welcomed me like an old friend. I approached the reference desk, where a young librarian with purple-streaked hair and kind eyes looked up expectantly. "Can I help you find something?" she asked. "Actually," I said, "I was wondering about your volunteer program." "I'm a retired librarian." Her face brightened. "We're always looking for experienced volunteers, especially for the children's reading hour." By the end of the day, I had a volunteer schedule, Tuesday and Thursday mornings, helping with the preschool story time, and afterward assisting with reshelving. A small commitment, but it felt like reclaiming a piece of myself that had been set aside when Melanie moved me out. That evening, Lydia and Jessica came for tea in my apartment. It had become a weekly ritual, this unlikely friendship born of crisis, now blossoming into something sustaining. We sat around my small table, steam rising from our mugs, as twilight settled over Madison. "I drove by your old house today," Jessica mentioned carefully, watching for my reaction. "The new family moves in next week. They've been helping with the painting." "What color?" I asked, genuinely curious rather than pained. "A soft yellow. Not too different from what it was." I nodded, pleased. Edward had chosen that buttery yellow the year before he died, saying it looked cheerful in all seasons. "Have you heard anything from Melanie?" Lydia asked, echoing Mark's earlier question. "No," I replied. "Just some legal correspondence. Her attorney contacted Mark about contesting the will changes." I shook my head at their concerned expressions. "It won't go anywhere. Mark made sure everything was properly documented, including assessments of my cognitive function." "Still," Jessica said gently, "it must be difficult. She's your only child." The observation hung in the air, an acknowledgement of the loss beneath my new beginning. "Yes," I admitted, allowing myself to feel the grief I'd been holding at bay. "It is difficult. When Melanie was little, she used to sit on my lap during story time at the library. She knew all the librarians by name. Somewhere along the way, she became someone I don't recognize." "People change," Lydia offered. "Sometimes back again, too." I appreciated the kindness of this suggestion, but knew better than to expect reconciliation. Some bridges once burned leave only ashes. As my guests prepared to leave, Jessica handed me an envelope. "From Eva," she explained. "She came to the trust office yesterday, asking if we could give this to you." Alone again, I opened the envelope with careful fingers. Inside was a handmade card, decorated with pressed flowers and childish but careful lettering. "Dear Grandma Grace, Mom and Dad say I'm not supposed to write to you, but I miss you. I'm sorry about what happened with your house. It wasn't fair. I saved the bookmark you gave me from the library. Mom tried to throw it away, but I hid it. Maybe someday I can see you again. Love, Eva." I traced the carefully formed letters, this small act of rebellion from a child learning that adults can be wrong, that loyalty isn't always simple. Setting the card on my bedside table, I moved to the window and looked out at the city lights. So much had changed in such a short time. My home, my relationship with my daughter, my daily routines. Yet beneath it all, I remained essentially myself. A librarian who believed in the power of stories, a widow who carried Edward in her heart, a woman who had discovered her own worth just when others had discounted it. The next morning I woke early and made tea in the soft dawn light. At my small writing desk, a welcoming gift from Mark, I took out a sheet of paper and began to write, not to Melanie or even to Eva, but to myself. Dear Grace, today begins a new chapter. The words flowed easily, the story of my life continuing beyond the betrayal that had threatened to be its final page. Not a happily ever after ending, perhaps, but something more truthful, a narrative of resilience, of quiet dignity reclaimed, of a woman who discovered that sometimes the most profound act of love is the decision to choose herself. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will talk.